Okay, before we install the Zend application skeleton, I'm just going to double check that my PHP and my Composer tool is working. So I've actually navigated into my PHP bin folder where I have PHP, and if I just do this, I can access my PHP command. And then I've gone ahead and actually installed Composer into this folder. And Composer simply is just a FAR file that gets downloaded and also checks your php.ini file for some settings. But once you have it installed, you can simply just execute PHP with that FAR file, and you'll go ahead and get some usage output for it. So as you can see here, essentially I have Composer running and it lists a whole bunch of options. And one of these options is this create project. And the create project is what we're going to use to create our Zend skeleton project. So let me clear off some of this information so we can start clean again. And let's talk about the create project command that we talked about in the previous slide. So this is the command. The first thing that I've had to do is I had to add the sudo command onto my particular create project command. The reason why I had to do that was MAMP installs itself into the applications folder on Mac OS X, which is outside of my home folder. And so, as such, it requires some permissions that my home user doesn't necessarily have. So by adding sudo on there, I'll go ahead and get application permissions to write and do some other things that I'll need to run this command. Then you'll notice that we have the PHP and the composer.far in there. And that is just essentially going to execute the Composer tool. And then the next thing that we specify is the create-project. That is the command that tells the Composer tool what we want to do. And in this case, we're going to give it a repository URL of our Zend skeleton application that we have from GitHub. And the -s and the dev just kind of tells that URL where to go in the sub URL of that GitHub application. Because with a GitHub account, you can have multiple applications, and this is just telling it to go find a particular subfolder or application on the GitHub account. And last, we have the folder that we want to install into. And this is the applications MAMP area. That's where my MAMP is installed. And I'm actually going to stick my project in there. If you want, you can put your project anywhere you want. You might have a projects folder. You may have another area where you want to put this. But one thing that you do need to make sure is that wherever you're installing this, it's an empty folder and there's nothing in it. If you try to install this in a folder with any kind of content in it, the Composer tool will go ahead and complain saying, hey, that folder's not empty, I'm not going to go ahead and install that. So let's go ahead and execute this command now and see what happens. I have to provide my password simply because I'm doing that sudo command. If you're on Windows, you're probably not going to need this, or if you're on Linux and you're installing this in an area that's inside your home directory, you're not going to need that sudo command. So you can see the first thing it does is it clones the skeleton application from GitHub and places it into your folder that you specify. And the last thing that the Composer tool is going to do for you is it's actually going to install your dependencies. The Zend framework has a way to add some dependency information on there using the Composer tool so that going to install Zend with inside of our vendor directory. And the last prompt it's asking for is if we want to remove any existing version control stuff such as your .git or .svns. And this is just something that it does to keep clean in case you are installing from an area where you're going to pull that information. In this case, I don't really care about version control system for this course, so I'm just going to go ahead and say yes. All right, and that is it. Let's go ahead and look at a file system now and see what actually happened there. Okay, so here's where my MAMP stack is installed. And inside of here, you'll notice that there's a Zend-app. And that was where we installed Zend to. If we look in here, we've got some content that skeleton app created. And one of the things that you'll want to keep in mind is that it has a vendor directory. And inside of the vendor directory, this is where you can have dependencies such as third-party plugins or other artifacts that you want to pull into your project. So what actually happened there was that when we cloned that skeleton application, we actually installed the Zend framework within inside of that application. As I said earlier, you could also install Zend so it's on the PHP include path, but it's kind of nice having it embedded in here because if you're going to push this out to a shared or hosted environment, you may not have control over that particular version of Zend or even having Zend installed at all. Our skeleton application is now kind of ready to roll since Zend is kind of embedded with inside of it. So before we actually run this and test out the Zend framework, we actually need to do one more thing to Apache to configure this correctly.